Hi, this is Dan Shields from Sentian. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our participants from Uganda and Gabon for part 3 of our Cyber Biosecurity Mentoring Program. It's great to have you join us again. In the previous video we provided to you, we focused on IT security and data privacy, and we're going to do a brief recap on that SOP in just a moment. Today we're going to focus on equipment and infrastructure, and quite specifically delving into that equipment and infrastructure that you use within your laboratory and that provided to you by your IT department, and making sure we understand any vulnerabilities that might create for you. In our next video, we're then going to focus on data sharing and third-party security. And what that is about is looking at the information that you transfer outside of your laboratory to other parties and entities. We're going to finish off with our videos looking at managing a cyber biosecurity incident, and that's about giving you a procedure and an action plan for responding to a potential cyber biosecurity attack. We're going to wrap up this program with a short workshop where we bring everybody back together again on video conference to talk about how we implement the cyber biosecurity SOPs and address any gaps or challenges that you might encounter. So I'm going to start off by doing a recap on the previous video and standard operating procedure, which is about IT security and data privacy. We had a number of activities and components of that SOP. The first one being about data classifications, and that looked at the information assets that you hold within your laboratory and identifying how to classify them and therefore match the security that we need to protect them to the type of data that you hold. The first classification, which is the one that has or requires the least amount of security, is the public classification. That's information that you interact with within your laboratory that is available within the public domain and really is not going to cause any harm to you if that is accessed. The second classification is what we call internal data. That is information that is not particularly sensitive but should still be only viewed or accessed by people that work within your laboratory. The third classification is what we call confidential data, and that is starting to get quite important in that if that was compromised, it would certainly cause you some sort of harm or damage. And the final classification is the most sensitive one called restricted data. If that information was compromised, it would cause you major harm. It could be major brand damage. It could cause financial losses. It could and most likely would result in some form of a legal issue or compliance breach. So the activities that we had within the SOP, the first one was a data classification exercise where we provided you with all the different types of data that you would hold within your laboratory. We grouped them against the 4 classifications, and we've asked you to review that data and customize or modify it for your laboratory in your institution to make sure it reflects who you are. We then need you to identify who the owner is and where that data is stored. So we do that for each of the 4 classifications to complete the data classification exercise. Now, the second activity within that SOP is around doing an IT risk assessment. And that is for the different areas of risk. So that is your network security, your application security, your endpoint security, which are your devices, your data security, and finishing off with physical security. We've identified the best practice control measures for each. And what we've asked you to do there is to review those controls, identify what you've got in place and what you don't, customize the information we've provided to reflect your institution and your laboratory, and then to finish off by assigning a risk rating to each. And that risk rating would be low, medium, or high, depending on how prepared you are and the types of controls you've already got in place for each of those areas. So that's our IT risk assessment. By doing that, it allows us then to complete activity number 3, which is identifying the IT security measures that you need to put in place to reduce the likelihood of you being impacted by a cyber biosecurity incident and also reduce or improve the way you respond. Now, that activity required you to take any of the gaps that you identified in the IT security risk assessment and apply it there to create an action plan going forward. And then we wrap up with the final part of this SOP, which is around cyber hygiene measures. They are the simple, low-cost actions that you can take to reduce the likelihood of a cyber biosecurity incident occurring. Things like improving your password protocols, doing awareness training for staff, not using public Wi-Fi hotspots, and so on. So what we ask you to do there is a status check to say, what are we doing? What are we not doing? And then to identify some actions to address those cyber hygiene gaps. To finish off that SOP, we ask you to complete those activities, but if you do have any questions or you require some additional assistance, we ask you to please reach out to myself or Rebecca from Sentient through HSP, and we'll be able to further support you with that. What we're about to do now is to move into SOP 3. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments to open up your third SOP, and I'll move out of these slides and into the SOP document as well. We're now going to resume our session by looking at Cyber Biosecurity Standard Operating Procedure number 3, Equipment and Infrastructure. You should have this available to you now and open on your screen. And as you'll see from this on my screen, we have the same format as the previous SOP. We need you to customize the document with your logo and also to put your institution name and on the front cover and also at the identified areas throughout the document. On page 2 of the document, we need you to populate it with the persons who is going to be responsible for updating this document and then reviewing and approving it as well. If we move on to the next page in terms of your document, we have an introduction like the previous one, and that will provide an overview of the SOP, a definition on how the SOP operates, and also the purpose of this procedure around equipment and IT infrastructure. Now we're going to move into some key definitions again, like we did in the previous video. The first one is a definition around IT security, and that is the practice of protecting information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction to ensure the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of your information. So IT security encompasses a wide range of day-to-day functions, practices, and technologies aimed at safeguarding your data, your hardware, your software, and your networks from threats and vulnerabilities. Now, we often see people confuse IT security with cyber security. There are very much similarities between the two, but cybersecurity is specifically focused on the practice of protecting your systems, your networks, and your data from digital attacks and unauthorized access and damage. So for cybersecurity, the practices that we focus on there are around network monitoring and detection for those types of threats. And if we do detect a particular event taking place, then we focus on IT and cybersecurity response to try and prevent the situation from escalating, from containing the attack, eradicating the threat, and then recovering your systems. Right, let's move into the activities for this particular SOP. If we move on to page 6, you'll see part 2, equipment and IT infrastructure vulnerabilities. Now, what we have in this component of your SOP are a number of tables. The first one is about your cyber physical equipment, and we talked about the types of cyber physical equipment in the previous SOP. They are the pieces of equipment that you utilize within your laboratory that are typically networked into your servers and your IT systems. They're great for improving your efficiency and your accuracy, but they also do present specific cyber biosecurity risks and vulnerabilities. So in this activity, what we're going to ask you to do is to identify or confirm the vulnerabilities that you're exposed to. We've identified or provided examples for each against each type of commonly used cyber physical piece of equipment there. So for example, your digital inventory equipment, the types of vulnerabilities that we might expect to see are unsecured network connections, lack of encryption, the use of outdated software, and inadequate access controls. So review those, identify if they apply to your laboratory, and also then I'd like you to identify who the owner of that equipment would be and who would be responsible for addressing some of these vulnerabilities. Then we move into the next one, the sample equipment and storage equipment, the sorts of vulnerabilities that we might expect to see there. Sensor manipulation, unauthorized access, and the potential for malware in those devices. Instrumentation, we might expect to see vulnerabilities like weak authenticity, remote access exploitation, firmware exploitation, and unauthorized external access. And then some of your automation systems for your building that affect your laboratory, the types of vulnerabilities that we might expect there are things like access control manipulation, old or outdated patching and system updates, and lack of physical security. There may be others that you also identify. So for this activity, what we'd like you to do is to review those vulnerabilities, modify them if they're not specifically appropriate for your lab, and add any additional vulnerabilities that you might identify, and then identify the owner for each of those, and that will complete our first activity. Now, the second activity involves doing exactly the same, but this time for your IT infrastructure. For your files, your database, your application servers, the sorts of vulnerabilities that we could expect to see are things like unencrypted files, the potential for ransomware, improper access controls, the potential for database using weak or default passwords, lack of encryption for sensitive files, and inadequate backup protection. For your workstations and laptops, the vulnerabilities that we might expect are things like malware infections, phishing attacks, and malicious links, outdated operating systems, it's the software, unsecured Wi-Fi, so particularly use of public Wi-Fi hotspots, and potentially the ability to use infected USB devices that plug into those workstations or laptops. For networking, the running of old software and firmware, the potential for a DDoS attack, poor firewalls or lack of firewalls, and the use of default credentials. In other words, everybody using the same credentials. For data storage devices, unencrypted data for external drives, the failure to secure your backups, vulnerabilities like poorly implemented access controls. For printers and scanners, vulnerabilities might include stored documents being able to be retrieved by hackers, network exposure due to lack of security, and again, unpatched firmware. If you're using webcams, the sorts of vulnerabilities that we could expect there are unsecured devices, then the potential for those webcams to be infected by malware and weak or no access controls. And then for your backup devices, unencrypted backups and inadequate access control policies. So they're example vulnerabilities for your IT infrastructure and equipment. So once again, would ask you to review these vulnerabilities, customize and tailor them to your institution, identify who the owners are that would be responsible for reducing the potential for those vulnerabilities to cause harm to your laboratory. Now, our third activity for this one, again, is exactly the same as the previous two, but this time for your software applications. For your operating systems, the big vulnerability we see is unpatched security flaws leading to access issues, system crashes, and weak password policies as well. The next one is about your lab management software, the potential for intercept of sensitive data when you're transmitting that information, unauthorized data manipulation due to weak access controls, and the use of outdated or unpatched software. For data analysis software, unsecured data analysis storage, so how you're storing that. Another vulnerability could be unmanaged permissions for your data files. For your security software, one of the big issues that we see creates vulnerability misconfigurations, which could create exploitation gaps, and also flaws in your antivirus protection. And then we've got vulnerabilities around software for transferring data to third parties, insecure data transfer protocols, lack of data encryption, insecure communication between data transfers. And there might be some others that you identify here as well. So what we ask you to do is review those vulnerabilities, customize them for your institution, and identify who is responsible for addressing those. And then we move on to page 9 of your SOP. So that is our first set of activities. The final activity is around identifying your minimum levels of protection, which is about reducing the risk of data compromise from a cyber attack within your laboratory. So what we've given you here is a table that identifies the control measures that you should be applying, examples of how you control those vulnerabilities, And what we'd ask you to do for this activity then is to look at those examples, identify which you are already doing, and then the gaps or the control measures that you are not applying, and they become your proposed actions. And then we need to identify who's going to be responsible. An example is for information security policies and frameworks. We should have a formal documented security policy in place, which is approved by management. We should have regular reviews and updates of those policies. We should have clear communication and distribution of those policies to all relevant personnel. And those policies should be aligned with legal, regulatory, and contractual obligations for your institution. If you don't have all those in place, identify your proposed actions and then who will be responsible. For our people security, including employees, contractors, and third parties, we should ideally have background checks and screening for those parties in place. We should have security access training for all staff on a regular basis. We should have confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements in place for those parties, particularly external parties. And we should be having defined roles and responsibilities regarding information security documented there. If you're missing some of those, they become your proposed actions. For management of IT and information assets, maintaining an inventory of all IT assets is really important. And we've already covered that off in this and previous SOPs. We've talked about classifying those assets based on sensitivity and business value, applying protection controls in line with that asset classification, and designating ownership. For authentication and access controls, we need to make sure we have strong authentication and access controls in place. So examples would be things like multi-factor authentication for critical systems and sensitive data, role-based access control, doing regular reviews of access control privileges, regularly reviewing your permissions and removal of anybody who's inactive, and securing your password, your data through secure password policies. Physical security. Examples include securing your premises with physical barriers and access controls, having surveillance in place, and visitor control procedures. For network and communication security, making sure you have appropriate firewalls in place, encryption of data in transit, regular monitoring of network traffic, and use of intrusion and detection prevention systems. And let's just skip down to the last couple for you. The first one is cyber biosecurity incident management. What's really important there is having an established, documented, and tested incident response plan in place, and having those monitoring tools, having clear communication channels for reporting cyber biosecurity incidents, and also then capabilities for forensic investigation of biological data breaches. Wrapping up with business continuity and IT disaster recovery around a formal, documented business continuity plan covering your critical business functions, regular risk assessments, and defining your backup strategies. So this activity is all about identifying whether you have those measures in place, and if you don't, then identifying, again, your action plans to reduce the risk of a cyber biosecurity incident affecting you, and also reducing the impact of that taking place. So that concludes our final activity in our third cyber biosecurity standard operating procedure. Please spend some time reviewing those activities, updating this procedure to reflect your institution and your laboratory, and then you'll be ready to move on to our next cyber biosecurity SOP. Thank you very much.